Okay, I'm today sitting here with my dear colleague and friend, Stuart Wicks from Travel Peru. He is managing director, formerly managing director from Tucano Reds. Stuart, you have something interesting to tell. It is about the time you came to Peru.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that because the older you get, the more you have to talk about. And I had a long period in Peru, but just to say a little bit before that, during my life before I came to Peru, I'd already travelled quite a lot. I had already lived in countries like Australia. I'd already travelled around most of the world. In my younger days, backpacking. In Spanish, they call it mochileros. It was the old, in those days, it was in the 70s, which was the well-known hippie trail. They used to run all the way through Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and through Arabia. And anyway, as I came into my late 20s, early 30s, I was at that period living in the UK. And as I said, I'd never really had thought much about South America. It was always regarded in those days, I'm talking about the 70s, the 80s, it was always regarded those days a bit of a no-go area, very turbulent, very topsy-turvy. A lot of military governments, coup d'etats. That was what I always subconsciously thought about South America. And although I knew a little bit about Peru, didn't really figure much on my radar. And then I met my wife, who was Veronica, and we this was the end of the 80s, and she was from Peru, and we married. And shortly afterwards, which was about 91, we decided to maybe just go to Peru for a little bit and sort of relax, enjoy the country, and no real plan. I'd actually reached a crossroads at that point, in which I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, and so I thought, well, okay, let's go to Peru and just spend some time there. And I think if I'd known a lot more about Peru at that time, I might have thought twice about it. This was the end of the 90s, at the end of the 80s, sorry, beginning of the 90s, and this was the period of a very precarious situation in Peru at the time. In fact, Peru had gone bankrupt. It was the ending period of the Garcia government, 85 to 91, and the beginning of Fujimori, who had won the election with Vladimir Montesinos. And so I entered just in that period, and I can remember flying from London to Miami, which was quite normal, and then we changed for a flight from Miami to Lima with Aero Peru. I mean, at the time when we bought the ticket, it meant nothing to me. But when I got on the aeroplane from Miami to Lima on Aero Peru, I realised this was a really antiquated airline, and a lot of the staff that worked on it, the air hostesses, didn't have a clue about how to serve or attend people on the aeroplane. The food was practically chucked at you. It was just very basic. And so I remember arriving to Lima airport, getting out of the aeroplane, and then going through the customs, and then coming out into the main hall of the airport, and just looking around me thinking, wow, what's this? And a lot of people, and this is where I made contact with Veronica's family for the first time. A lot of families in Peru are very big families, and this was no exception. Huge family with a big sign saying, welcome Stuart and Veronica, etc. And so we were met, and then we were quickly taken out of the airport, and we went to the car that the family had. And this is where I started to realise that this was quite simple in Peru. I remember boarding into a Volkswagen, 8 of us more or less getting into a Volkswagen, hanging out the window, and me hanging onto the door to make sure it didn't open because it couldn't shut properly, and it was an old Volkswagen, and that was the start of my experience in Peru, and I didn't have a great deal of money at the time. I came with a certain amount of capital, but not a great deal, and so over the days and the weeks, I soon realised that Peru was in a very difficult situation, and it wasn't an easy lifestyle here, but I felt committed to the experience, and I decided that we'll take each day as it comes, and let's give it a good go. And so the weeks went by and the months went by. I began to teach English, which brought some income into our hands. We lived at the beginning with my mother-in-law at the end of Benavides, on the just passing the Puente Benavides. Can't remember the name of the area now. And so that was the beginning. So I began teaching English, and this went on for probably went on for probably about 91, 92, right the way through to about 95, 96. I carried on doing that. That business, if you like, grew as my name became more known, and it was the old phrase is always true. People pass your name around, and so little by little, I went from teaching in the colleges to actually teaching private, and I got to teach some of the very influential people in Peru. People like Movilla, the original managing director of Telefonica, which was the company that came into Peru around about 94, I think, took over the state telecommunication system, and began to develop the private sector for telecommunications. And I got involved in teaching all the hierarchy of Telefonica English. What they wanted more than anything else was to talk English, and they all seem to have this affection for English, which means the English from Great Britain. They just loved the accent. It's something until now I find quite strange, but anyway, they loved all of that. And as my name grew, the number of clients I was teaching privately grew. People like Movilla, as I mentioned, Telefonica, Central Min, just to name a few, and it just grew and grew. And so I had this income coming from teaching English, and this helped us to develop business ideas, in which we first of all began a company called Intersun, which was a company to sell solar panels. So the money I got from teaching English, we funneled that all into that business. That business didn't really take off. It was too difficult. Peru was in a tremendous recession at the time. There wasn't much money around, and so it just didn't really take off. We made a couple of sales. I remember we installed a solar system for a swimming pool. We sold special solar lights up in Iquitos in the jungle, but really it didn't really take off. We did one government project, which was a study in Huaraz for the local communities to have solar panels in remote areas of Huaraz.
Huaraz in the center of Peru.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we went there for about a week. We had to invest all our own money in this project, in this study, if you like, in which we hired 4-wheel drive and with a guide, and we went around the whole of Huaraz, in the remote areas of Huaraz, in this 4-wheel drive, stopping at all the different communities, and looking at the how they live, the infrastructure, and then to sort of give the study about how we could implement solar panels in there.
You would say that you were pioneers at the time.
Yeah, definitely were pioneers. Yeah, I mean, there was no solar panels in Peru. Nobody was selling them, and it seemed like a great project or a great business to be in. But what we became in the end was just a huge focal point for everybody to come to our office. And I'm talking about the local mayors from all over Peru, other people coming to the office, looking at the panels, having a good chat, having a good talk, and then more or less asking if we can give the panels for free. You know, we weren't in that position to do that. I mean, I was just teaching English, trying to survive. We even went on TV as well. We did a presentation on one of the local TV channels. But it was an interesting idea, an interesting project, and looking back on it, it was a really interesting experience. But in the end, what we did was, as we realised that this project wasn't really going to give us a living, we created another company which was called Tucano Reps, which was the travel agency. In the beginning, you know, we're talking about, this was around about Intersum was the solar panel company, was more or less from 92 to about 94, and then Tucano came in around about 93, and was more or less in parallel with Intersum, and we started Tucano with just I remember we brought an electric typewriter, not very expensive one, electric type. We didn't have a computer, and one lady to answer the phone, and that was it. We were selling at the beginning just flight tickets, local, national flight tickets, and international flight tickets. Obviously, you know, with any business like that, you've got to develop a network of contacts, so that people buy your tickets. And so, where did the network come from? It came from all the people I was teaching English.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I was getting fantastic accounts. Like, for example, Telefonica. I was getting some business in Telefonica. Companies like Movia, Central Min, and I can't remember all the others, but you know, there was already a base of clients that because they knew me. It wasn't difficult to involve in the English conversation about how about buying flight tickets from you, and then passing my business card for Tucano. And so we started selling national flight tickets and international flight tickets, which in those days, in the 90s, was an extremely lucrative business. You could earn quite a good commission on the flights, because all the airlines in those days worked with the travel agencies more than direct with the public, because we know at that time we didn't have the internet, you know, the internet, the emails, etc. That wasn't there. So
93, of course.
yeah, and so you know, in those days, people just brought in the agency. You know, they rang, they ordered their tickets, or they came to the office, and so you were able to make business doing that. And so, you know, we survived until the end of the 90s, just growing the business on flight tickets. But during that period of about 93, 94, we started to think about developing the company also in the area of incoming tourism, which in Spanish they call receptivo. And so within about 3 or 4 years, we had 1 or 2 clients that started to buy from us from America. And so, you know, from about 96, 97, 98, we began to develop the incoming tourism, i.e. working with people abroad and bringing people from abroad. Meanwhile, we carried on with the international flight tickets and national flight tickets, which was the major part of our business. And so that's how we more or less went along for about until about the year 2000. By about 1996, I had stopped teaching English because the company really was starting to pick up more, and you know, it was more possible for me to for the company to support me. And also that, you know, to grow a company, there comes a point where you've got to give 100%.
Yeah, dedicate you completely to
Yeah, it absorbed me
task.
completely. Yeah, and so the teaching started to stop. And during that period, the other difficult things that you encounter in a country like Peru is the ability to borrow money. You know, we didn't have any assets, we didn't have any house, we didn't really have a car either at that time, and so I used to frequent the banks quite a lot, and develop relationships on the basis that we could speak English. There was one particular chap who was a bank manager at a bank called Banco de Credito in the what was called Puente Ricardo Palma, Senor Ruiz, who's not alive now actually. But I used to get a lot of favours from him in terms of small loans, just by sitting there and saying, how about speaking some English? And he used to love that. And in those days, the banks gave the managers a lot more autonomy in giving or lending money. And that money I used to borrow used to go into the account of Tucano, and that was used to purchase flight tickets, etc. Because the clients would never pay you that same day; you'd give them a week or 2 weeks for them to pay you. So you needed to have money to carry over to those periods where, you know, they had borrowed money from you, and you had to borrow money from the bank, and so that's how we worked it all the way through the 90s up until about 2000. Then by 2000, the incoming tourism from the company had grown. It was really starting to grow a lot. We'd already been 2 times by that time to places like the World Travel Market to promote the brand, and so it really started to grow. And it was very lucky because at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. This was when the airlines changed their policy towards travel agencies. One day to the next, they decided they were not going to work with travel agencies anymore, and the commissions of 20 and 30% had gone. This caused a catastrophe to a lot of traditional companies in Peru, because there was no longer the ability, or there was no earnings, and so we dropped obviously the international flights. We maintained national flights because that complemented the incoming tourism that we had. And by this point, we already had sufficient business in which we could survive and carry on growing. All through the 90s, Peru was in a very, very, I wouldn't say strange situation. Certainly at the beginning of the 90s, it was a no-go country. It was very isolated. It was a country that if anybody could, they would leave the country. Nobody would even dream of coming into the country. That's why people found it very strange that I'd actually come into the country to live, and because everybody was leaving. Traditionally, they always left to go to America. This was the traditional place to emigrate or disappear or to make another life. And so, you know, at the beginning of the 90s, Peru was in such a situation that, you know, you couldn't really travel outside of Lima. This was controlled by a terrorist group called the Sendero Luminoso, run by a guy called Abu Guzman.
The Shining Path.
The Shining Path, yeah. It had reached the peak of its power in those first years that I arrived. It had grown on the back of Peru from about 85 onwards. Although Garcia, who was the president from 85 to 90, had inherited from Belaúnde, who had also given on a plate the beginning of the terrorist growth. By the time I arrived there, it was pandemic. It was just, you couldn't go anywhere outside of Lima really, and tourism. Nobody came to Peru. It was absolutely empty. You could go to Cusco, you could go anywhere, like Pune, any of the traditional places. You're not finding any tourists. And so, so it was a very, very precarious time, but also looking back on it, a very interesting time, because I actually experienced the very old Peru, the Peru that's no longer here now. It was the country where everything was made within its own borders. It produced its own clothing. Its national network was completely controlled by the government. The trains were controlled by the government. Everything was actually controlled by the state, really. Even the mining, a lot of the mining projects were controlled by the government, called Central Min. And so, it was a period which was coming to an end, really. But I lived those last 3 years or so amongst that sort of atmosphere. And then around about 94, 95, this was the period where they'd actually destroyed the Shining Path. They'd captured Abu Guzman. He'd been put away in prison, and it was the decline of the terrorist movements. You still had a further one which took the Japanese residency, which was the Tupac Amaru, I think it was called Tupac Amaru. But they were also taken out as well after the siege. And so by about 94, 95, which came into the second term of Fujimori, the problems of the terrorism had been eliminated, and the country was now on the point of growing, really. Although one didn't know that at the time. And then the government began privatizing everything, the telecommunication network, the trains, etc., etc., etc.
Transport system.
Yeah, everything started to become privatized. Even the mining, the minerals, etc. And so, as a company, Tucano grew on the back of the change. So as the country became more stable, it started to grow, tourism started to grow, and more or less by about 2000, it was starting to turn. Peru was starting to receive quite a lot of tourists, but nothing like it receives now. It was still very, very little, and nobody could even imagine reaching that milestone of 1 million tourists. It was just unbelievable. It was just, you're talking about, 100,000.
It was really the beginning.
It was really the beginning. Yeah. It was the beginning of everything. And it began more or less after the millennium. And so we grew on the back of all of that, growing and growing. And the other thing that was interesting when I look back on it was how the information that you shared with your clients changed as well. I can remember going to the first few world travel markets in London, for example, in the mid-90s, and you would go with pages and pages of documents. You go with brochures, big books with all your tours in them. You'd have to go probably with about 2 or 3 suitcases, because you wanted to distribute all the information that you had at the world travel market, and that was how it was in those days. And the information, the technology was just starting. The mobile phones were just starting in the mid-90s, and the internet started to come in the mid to latter part of the 90s too. But until the end of the 90s and the beginning of 2000s, it was very much a paper-orientated situation. So you would, go to any of these trade shows, you'd be with lots and lots of paper. And then I can remember you got the disc that came, where everything started to go onto a disc. And then eventually it finished up with the chip, what do you call it? Everything that all those 3 suitcases that you used to have all went on that chip that you just slotted into the side of your computer and you gave to the client. And that was the whole progress that I witnessed from the very time that it was paper to these chips that used to slide in the back of your machine.
You witnessed also a technical development.
Yeah, huge. The development of the website. I mean, the website didn't really sort of come into its fruition until the beginning of the millennium. And then when it started to come, it was gradual. A lot of suspicion, a lot of people took time to change. And also the technology was very, was in its beginnings. And so when you look back on all that, you look how business is done now. Everything's done through the website. What the website did really, certainly in terms of the Peruvian business, it gave the opportunity to a lot more people, because until that all developed, the incoming travel agencies were a very, very select group of people that had the financial resources to travel abroad and promote the brand. It'd been like that forever and ever until the advent of the website. And then bit by bit, the website changed everything, because with a website, you can be anywhere in the world. You can be in your living room in Peru, and you can be selling directly to somebody outside. You don't necessarily have to be in a trade show anymore. And so bit by bit, it started to erode into the business of the traditional group of agents that controlled everything. I can remember one day in Lima, one Australian fellow, I think it was Australian, I can't remember his name now. He came to the office on a recommendation, because we work with a number of clients, and one of our clients had recommended him to come to see us, because we had a very good name, very good reputation as being a very we would respond very quickly to people's inquiries. People would get the information very quickly. We weren't a company that hung about for too long with sending emails and programs. So we were very well known for our speed, as well as the very good quality of operations that we used to manage when the clients used to arrive. A lot of customer satisfaction. So this guy came and he wanted to work with us directly, and it turned out that he had this fantastic website. This is probably around about 2004, 2005. Had this unbelievable website, and we looked at it. You thought it was a huge company. In fact, he was actually living in a small flat in Miraflores. Yeah, and he was managing all his business through the website from Miraflores, which is a very nice part of Lima, and bringing people from abroad. And that's how things have grown from what it used to be, and so now the business of tourism has changed 360 degrees. There's a lot more people in the market now selling to the incoming market who don't necessarily need to travel anymore, and it's a good thing. Yeah, I think it's a very good thing. I think it gives people equal opportunities, because Peru is a country that is very, very is socially divided. There's a lot of social levels here, which if you're coming from Europe or from England, you can sometimes find that a little bit difficult to deal with. But it's a way of life here. And so within these social circles, you've got the social circle within the businesses and within your private life. And the social circle of the businesses was controlled by a very select group of fairly wealthy people during the 90s. And that social divide in some ways was pierced and not totally broken, but certainly influenced by the advent of the website, which broke down those things.
So you can see a huge change since 2004, 2005. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean the change in business has changed a lot. I can remember in the last times that I went to the trade shows, you no longer sat at your desk on what they call Peru stand and waited for the people to come to you, or accosted people who are walking along past your desk, say, come in and buy. That more or less finished in the last few times I went there, because everybody was, through the technology, were already pre-arranging everything and setting up everything already. The technology was making the world a much smaller place, and the whole ethics of doing business was changing, and that you have to be aware of that. And you have to change with that. Any change can be a positive change if you know how to use it, and so that was definitely by the time you reached 2014, 2015, 16, etc., up to 2020, things have changed dramatically.
And Peru also has changed, I imagine, because before maybe the infrastructure was very basic, and when tourism came in more and more, also that must have changed, I think.
I think that with the growth of tourism from the millennium until now, there's been a phenomenal growth. I mean, Peru now, I think, is on the same levels as countries like Chile, Argentina, in terms of the number of tourists coming into the country. And you've only got to look at places like Machu Picchu, which when I remember back in the very beginnings of 91, 92, 93, all the way through the 90s, even into the early part of the millennium, you could turn up at the doorstep or the front door of Machu Picchu and just go in.
Wow.
You could just walk, and there were times when there was nobody there. Certainly in the early 90s. And so, but now you have to pre-book a ticket in advance. Yeah. I think weeks and months in advance, to even get into Machu Picchu now. And that's a reflection of just how much tourism has changed in Peru. So you've got a lot more tourists coming into Peru. If you look at the hotel infrastructure that exists now, it's phenomenal. If you look at places like Lima and around the touristic areas of Miraflores, the number of hotels that exist in that area is just phenomenal compared to what it was in the 90s.
So it generated more businesses. People became wealthier at certain points.
Certain people have become very wealthy on the back of tourism, without any doubt at all, because when you look at the volume of tourists coming to this country, it's phenomenal now. And you look at places like Machu Picchu, which are very closed areas in the sense that, if you go to Machu Picchu and you've got to stay in Machu Picchu, you stay in Aguascalientes, you have to take the train into Aguascalientes. And so, companies like, Peru Express, Peru Rail, sorry, these types of companies, I mean, they've done very, very well. I mean, they fought very hard to maintain their control over things like the trains, because in the beginning, for many, many years, they were the only train company going into Machu Picchu. I mean, can you imagine that? It was complete control. And then bit by bit, you got companies like Inca Rail that came, but they came much later into the scenario. Before that, it was just Peru Rail. They owned the classic hotels like the Monastery in Cusco. They got the hotel at the top of the ruins, Machu Picchu Sanctuary. They have the train, etc., etc. I mean, it's it's brilliant, and they still have a lot of wealth coming out of that, even with with Inca Rail that's in there now. But the face of tourism definitely has changed a lot, and
it will change. We are now in times of coronavirus. What do you expect from the future?
Well, I think I've been here since I came first in February this year for a visit, and then I decided I had to come back again in March. I came around about the middle of March, and I've been here since the middle of March. I decided to stay out the time here in Lima, because to go back to England, it was also very difficult there as well. So in the end, I decided to stay here for all the time of the pandemic, which was from March, April, May, and was this June. I'm still here now. I'm probably looking to return to England about the middle of July. But you know, it's been an incredible experience to actually sit or walk or look and see how things are completely shut down. And so you're looking at a country, a world has been completely switched off. Tourism, which is one of the most vulnerable industries you can imagine, instantaneously switched off as well. And from one day to the next, everybody was looking at no business. And this is always one of the big dangers of tourism, is that tourism relies on the world functioning and ticking over economically, no? And what happened was that everything switched off. So, you know, you're watching hotels becoming emptier, the agents having to cancel all their tours, probably having to return quite huge sums of money as well, and just watching their business just evaporating. And in terms of the future, I think one can only hope that things will return to some sort of normality. But we're also experiencing huge changes in the world, not just with the pandemic problem, but also with the environment, the climate. And these factors are going to play out more and more in the coming months and years, which one can only imagine will change the way that we work in this world, or we do business in this world. I don't think any of us really can imagine how that will be. But you know, tourism will always exist. Tourism will always be there because people are always intrigued. People want to travel. People want adventure. You know, it's always been like that in the world for hundreds and thousands. It's always been like that. So tourism will always be there, but one cannot see at the moment just how it's all going to pan out in the future. But true. You know, one has to be aware that countries like Peru, in terms of tourism, has to be careful of tourism, because tourism also can affect the environment a lot too. So all these things have to be worked out and controlled as we go into the future.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Thank you for being here.
That's my pleasure. It's been very nice to sit with you and to you know, to talk about this period that I experienced and to share this with you and with everybody else. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,